I am up for the challenge. That's why we're working on climate action. So I gave myself the challenge of explaining a 490-page proposed ruling by the SEC, 14,000 comments of pros and cons in 11 minutes. So that's what we're going to go over today. How many of you work with public companies, publicly listed companies here in the US, advise, invest in them? So this is what's raised a lot of questions, a lot of comments from publicly listed companies here in the US. Essentially, the SEC is catching up with regulations that have already taken shape in Europe and other regions abroad. What we're going to talk about today is ESG at a glance. I know this acronym has been thrown around a lot, and I want to make sure everyone has a clear picture of what ESG means. Then we're going to talk about what does the 490 pages of the SEC proposed climate risk disclosure document really say, and what is it advising companies to do? Then we're going to zoom in on a couple of the key disclosures that if you were a publicly listed company, you would be preparing right now to ready yourself for this ruling. And then we're going to talk about the pros and cons. These 14,000 comments, what are people upset about, happy about, what do they want to see, and we'll land on that. So what is ESG? This wheel on the left side is what I consider the traditional wheel of the E, S, and G areas. So environment, social, and governance, standard items that you would think about, that you would attach to each of these areas. On the right side here, we created this a little bit more of a colorful graphic of this iceberg to really describe ESG, what you see externally, so everything above the surface. You might see a sustainability report, a web page, public announcements of goals, but all of those external commitments are backed up by a lot of work, a lot of team members working behind the scenes to really shore up a solid ESG foundation. So you'll see items there like metrics tracking, risk identification, code of conduct for the company, for your suppliers, data collection, implementation, management meetings on ESG, and risk analysis. Why is this important? ESG has become increasingly important to key stakeholders. That means the regulators, investors, customers are demanding transparency around ESG. Banks are constrained on what to finance, and governments are increasing their focus on ESG and developing ESG goals. We also know that companies care about how they're looked at externally from a ratings perspective. So there are a number of credit ratings agencies that are now considering your ESG metrics in terms of how they determine your credit score. And then there are ESG rating specialists. So there's another acronym soup here of different organizations that literally scrub the internet and have analysts looking for everything that your company is doing across E, S, and G, and they give you a score. And these scores matter. And then on the right, data service providers. So these are organizations that also have a team of analysts scrubbing and collecting data and analyzing and pulling together these massive data sets around everything that each of the publicly listed companies are doing across E, S, and G. Now, why is the SEC proposing these new disclosure rules? Where is this coming from? As I said, in the EU, they've been on this track for many, many years, so they're way ahead of us. They've also followed a similar focus in terms of rolling out the types of disclosures that they want publicly listed companies to put forth. Investors, though, are really the ones who are seeking more information. They realize that climate risk is financial risk. And if they can't really peek under the hood and see how their companies would perform on different climate risk scenarios, they're kind of investing blindly, right? So they've been pushing for this. They also say they need a more consistent, comparable, and reliable information. So a lot of times, without a standard, without a framework, you're left to companies putting forth their information in a number of different ways. And so you're comparing apples to oranges to pears to bananas, and it's really hard to understand what is what. The SEC has said that the proposed disclosures are fundamental to investors' understanding of the nature of a registrant's business and prospects. So this is really where this is coming from. Who does it affect? Well, it affects all registrants. So here in the US, that means smaller reporting companies, emerging growth companies, foreign private issuers, companies planning to enter the US capital markets for the first time by an IPO, and acquisition targets of public companies in a Form S-4. So everyone is really focused on this. Even though it's a proposed, and I'll underline proposed ruling, The publicly listed companies that we work with are already preparing for this. So we're working with them on getting their disclosures ready. Everyone is preparing as if this is going to come to be. What are the various components of the new rules? So there are disclosures that are required outside of your audited financial statements, and then disclosures in the audited financial statements. Both are very important. Narrative disclosures about climate-related risks are outside, but inside, you have to show your climate-related impacts of events and transition activities on each financial statement line item. You have to show an aggregate amount of climate-related costs, climate-related impacts on estimates and assumptions used to prepare your financial statements. Also, you have to measure and report your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So those are first subjected to limited audit or assurance, but eventually you will be audited for those. And the timeline, that's the big question. So this is a proposed ruling. It received 14,000 plus comments, which means that the SEC is really analyzing what to do next. And so it's TBD in terms of when this will get approved. But the ruling is based on TCFD. So TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has you organize your thought process around climate-related risks in these 4 categories. So governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. This next chart here kind of dives a little bit deeper into each of these areas. And I know I'm moving fast. I'm happy to share these slides with the group after as well. But you'll see across each of these 4 categories, there's homework to do. There's a number of items that you have to do to get your governance strategy in place at the board and management level. Then you have to map out your short, medium, and long-term plans to address these risks. And you have to address climate-related risks throughout your organizational structure and develop a data tracking system. So it's a lot of work. And one of the things that we talk about, and one of the things that shows up in these 14,000 comments, is the amount of work and the budget that's required to actually make all of these bullet points come to life. From a TCFD scenario analysis perspective, what they're asking you to analyze are physical risks. So you'll see those here listed in this graphic, and then transition risks. So transition risks are risks that come with the transition to a low carbon economy. So they could be something like a policy, a change in regulation, change in technology, change in the market, so your customers want different products, or a change in reputation as well. One case study I just wanted to mention just to kind of land this is Jaguar Land Rover. So Jaguar Land Rover in the UK invested £500 million in a state-of-the-art engine facility. And they did a ribbon cutting ceremony. We're very happy to launch that facility in May of 2020. November of 2020, just months later, the UK government announced the phase out of new petrol and diesel cars. So that brand new state-of-the-art engine facility that they invested £500 million on, what are they going to produce with it, right? And then shortly thereafter, June 2022, the EU Parliament banned combustion engines as well. So if they would have gone through this scenario analysis planning on what the regulatory risks look like, maybe they would have spent that £500 million a little bit differently. But in May of 2020, they cut the ribbon. They were super excited. Their CEO said at the bottom there, the Engine Manufacturing Centre represents all that is great about British engineering. They were very proud about it. So that's just one example of why it's important for the board to engage. So really quickly, the 14,000 comments, why are people pro and con over this issue? So there are a lot of concerns. One is around the ability to measure and disclose scope 3, which is your value chain emissions. And here's a quote directly from one of the comments, that scope 3 reporting will be expensive. You have to reach out to all of your suppliers and gather that data. And they say the smaller suppliers say they can't afford it. They don't have the time. There are concerns about disclosing risks and ESG targets publicly. So CFOs are very nervous about disclosing anything that would make investors feel like this investment is not a good one in the future. So any talk of disclosing more risks makes them very nervous. Concerns about GHG disclosures in a post-COVID recovery world. So if we're talking about our numbers, and maybe we're not back up to our normal yet, our new normal, are we reporting numbers that might not be accurate moving forward? Concerns about bandwidth and internal capacity to manage this new work stream. It's estimated that for publicly listed companies, large companies, it'll cost them around $500,000 plus just to do this work. So that's another line item that they hadn't planned for. But there are a lot of opportunities. So there are opportunities for ESG activities in areas to be elevated to the board level and maybe get more funding and more love from the board. There's also the opportunity for first movers, companies that are really making good progress in this space to demonstrate strong performance. So that's just a quick update. I did it as fast as I could. I know there's a lot on the slides too, so I'm happy to share those with the group afterwards. I'm around till tomorrow as well and happy to answer questions, but thank you.